Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Kids Talk Church History. Kids Talk Church History is a one-of-a-kind podcast where kids investigate the history of the church. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." How has Jesus built and preserved his church against all odds? Come with us on a trip through history to find the answer on Kids Talk Church History, a podcast in partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals.
The Reformation in France was troubled from the start, with Protestants and Roman Catholics fighting against each other. Some peace, however, was restored in 1598 with King Henry IV's Edict of Nantes. But this peace did not last long. Henry's only son, Louis XIII, wanted France to be a Roman Catholic country and began to make life very difficult for the Protestants. Stay with us as we learn about the Huguenots and how they resisted the king's impositions here on Kids Talk Church History. I'm Sophia, I'm 16, and I live in Orlando, Florida.
I'm Emma, I'm 17, and I live in Raleigh, North Carolina.
And I am Grace. I am 13, and I also live in Raleigh, North Carolina.
I think we talked about the Huguenots in another episodes, but could you remind us who they were?
Yeah, so that was in episode 41, and the Huguenots was just a name given to the French Protestants.
I read that Louis XIII took away many rights from the Huguenots, but the next king, Louis XIV, was even worse, right?
Yes, Louis XIV canceled the Edict of Nantes altogether, taking away all rights from the Huguenots. Huguenot churches were closed, and Huguenot pastors had 2 weeks to either become Roman Catholic or leave the country. If they became Roman Catholic, they would receive a big raise, but most pastors chose to leave. Other Huguenots left as well. I've read that from 1560 to 1760, more than 200,000 Huguenots left France.
I think many Huguenots came to North and South Carolina at that time. The others went to Protestant countries in Europe like the Netherlands, Germany, and England.
Yeah, it was a great loss for France because they were excellent workers and good citizens. So you can look online and find a list of famous Huguenots who left the country.
France's loss, other nations gain.
But I imagine not everyone could leave. For example, if they had a farm and lived off of its products, they couldn't really take that with them.
Right, and the trip itself was dangerous. Some paid a smuggler to take them out, traveling by night and hiding during the day. Others tried to leave by ship, but many died during the journey.
Many of those who stayed back worshipped as Protestants in secret, and they became known as the Church of the Desert, but it was risky.
Yeah, because if they were caught, the women would be sent to jail and the men to the galleys, which were in the warships, where they were forced to row long hours chained to their benches.
I read that some tried to fight the government.
Yes, they were known as the camisards, camisa meaning shirt in some regions of France, and they wore white shirts so they could recognize each other at night, but they eventually lost. Then, in 1715, a 19-year-old Huguenot, Antoine Court, proposed a resistance and reformation without violence. And this is where the main character of our episode, Marie Durand, comes in. Her brother Pierre was a friend of Antoine, and after becoming a pastor, he traveled around France preaching and organizing churches, but he was eventually killed.
Marie and her family continued to worship in secret after his death.
They were able to for a while, but her mother was captured, and they never heard from her again. Then Marie and her father were captured too and taken to prison.
I read that the government gave all the Huguenots a chance to be free. They just had to become Roman Catholic.
I can see why they would refuse.
Well, some Huguenots gave up, or at least pretended to change sides, but others didn't. Marie stayed in prison for 38 years. From prison, she wrote many letters and helped some influential Frenchmen to understand the injustice done to Protestants.
38 years is a long time, especially since prisons back then were pretty bad.
Yeah, and this prison was no exception. All the women were in one room, and there was just a few small windows, so the air was very bad. Also, the windows were up high and could not be closed, so if it rained, the water went inside the prison. There were also a lot of mosquitoes because the prison was built near a swamp.
I've read that there were also children in the prison.
Yes, they allowed young children to stay with their mothers. When they grew up, they were taken away. Marie taught them the Bible and other school subjects. She also tried to help other prisoners, including her brother's mother-in-law, who was just captured because her daughter had married a Protestant.
I can imagine how angry she must have been because she didn't really choose to be a Protestant.
Yes, but Marie was kind to her anyhow.
So, how old was Marie when she was imprisoned?
So she was 19 and she had just become engaged. Her fiancé was also imprisoned.
So 19 plus 38, 57. She was 57 when she was released.
But I think she looked a lot older with all the suffering she had to endure.
So remind me how she was released. I don't remember. Did the laws change?
So not yet, but all the letters written by Marie had reached some very important people in government. Other people were writing too, but I think she was the only one writing from prison. So finally, a prince decided to visit the prison and was so moved that he released 2 women immediately and then pressed the government to release all the others.
What happened to Marie after she left?
Her troubles were certainly not over because someone had taken over her farm, so she actually had to pay to get her own property back. After that, she lived peaceably with another woman from prison until she died at the age of 65. But we have a lot of questions about Marie and the Huguenots, and we can't wait for our special guest to tell us more. He's Reverend Campbell Markham, minister of Scots Church in Fremantle, Western Australia, and he's written a book about Marie Durand. Reverend Markham, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So we talked a little bit about Marie Durand and the Huguenots, and there's so much more we could say, but you wrote the book about her. So what's the title and when will it be published?
Yeah, thank you. So the book has a simple title, Marie Durand, 1711 to 1776, French Protestant prisoner and heroine of the faith.
So what inspired you to write this book?
So I love the French language. I love church history, and I was looking for someone from church history who maybe was well known in France, but maybe not so well known in English-speaking countries. So I came across Marie Durand, and I found that she'd written 48 letters. 48 of her letters survived. Her letters had never been published in English. And I was also really amazed by her story that she'd been a prisoner for 38 years. And she could have left prison at any time by agreeing to be a Catholic, but she didn't do that. So I was really impressed by her faithfulness and her courage. And I wanted more people to know about Marie Durand outside of France.
So my biggest question about this time period is, where did the name Huguenots come from?
Yeah, it's a great question, and no one knows exactly. So the best guess is that it comes from a Dutch word, Huisgenoten, and I probably said that wrong, but it means housemates. And it seems to have been applied, first of all, to Swiss Protestants and then later on to French Protestants, but no one really knows where the word came from.
So I've read that they found a word carved in the stone inside the prison. I think it was register. What does that mean? And do we know who carved it? Some websites say it was Marie Durand.
Yes, there is a very famous inscription in the prison, and I visited the prison about 5 years ago in the south of France, and it was very, very moving to be able to do that. And I saw that inscription, and the third letter looks like a G, but I'm pretty sure it's an S, so it's just a bad S, and that the word is actually résister. So it's the French word résister, which means to resist. And although a lot of people say that Marie carved that word herself, there's no evidence for that. And we don't know who carved the word, but it has become linked to Marie Durand.
So Marie Durand wrote many letters that influenced important people in the French government. Did any other prisoners do the same?
Yes, we have a letter from her to the Marquis d'Argenson, who was a very important French minister at the time. And we also have a letter from her to the Queen of France, and that is one of my favorite letters of Marie Durand. We don't have other letters from prisoners to important people. So I think her letters to the French state are very, very important.
Did anyone in the government write her back? How did her letters not get at the bottom of their mail pile?
We don't have any letters, any surviving letters to Marie Durand. So we have her 48 letters that she sent, 48 surviving letters, but we don't have any, except one written by her father. We do have one written from the Palace of Versailles to Marie Durand, but it never arrived. It never made it to her. So unfortunately, we don't have letters that Marie would have read from the French state.
But why did anyone like listen to her? I guess that's kind of my biggest question. Why did anyone who received her letters pay any attention with so many other things going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And she wrote many letters, and some of her letters were written to pastors. And she pleaded with the pastors to please help us. We are destitute. We're in trouble in this prison. We need help. Can you please help get us support? And so the pastors that she wrote to, one of them in particular, Paul Robot, he provided a lot of help and support for Marie and the other prisoners. The letters that she sent to the state, to the Queen, for example, we don't have any evidence that they were actually read, or they certainly weren't acted upon.
So she also wrote many letters to her niece Anne, Pierre's daughter, that were very inspiring. Do you have a favorite quote from one of Marie's letters?
Yes, of the 48 letters, 16 of them were written to her orphaned niece, and this was the daughter of her beloved brother, Pierre. And Pierre was a pastor who was captured, and in fact, he was put to death for his faith and for being a Christian pastor. And Marie really loved her brother. And when he died, he had 3 children, but his wife died, and the two of the children died, leaving just Anne. And so Anne was an orphan. She was in Geneva, and Marie tried to mother Anne from her prison, which was just amazing. A distance of about 500 kilometers. She sent letters trying to care for Anne. She sent her clothes that she made in the prison. She tried to arrange for money to be sent to her. She did all she could to look after Anne, and she sent her a lot of motherly advice and counsel. And here's one of my favorite quotes from Marie to Anne. And she wrote this in 1740. So she'd been in prison for 10 years by now. She said to Anne, "True Christians will not be condemned for having abandoned the purity of the gospel, for in fact they make constant profession of it. They will, however, be condemned for not visiting Jesus Christ in prison, in the person of his members. I exhort them by the compassion of God to reignite their charitable zeal for the poor and suffering, and to remember that the Lord Jesus promises to repay even the gift of a glass of cold water to his children. How much more will he reward those who sustain his elect, who fight under the standard of the cross?"
Wow, that is really beautiful. So in addition to writing to Anne, was she able to write letters to her fiance and her father? I know you mentioned that she got a letter, or that we have a surviving letter from her father, but what happened to her father and her fiance?
Yes, so her father and her fiance were in fact imprisoned in the same place. And we have that letter from Etienne Durand to Marie. And he urged her, I'll give you a little quote from his letter. He said to her, "You can see that your brother Pierre has left everything to labor at the Lord's work, and he cannot show himself openly. And yet I believe that he has not lost courage. Do the same." So he really urged Marie to continue to be courageous and to hold firm to her faith, even though he knew that would mean a great deal of suffering. So we don't have any surviving letters from Marie to her father or to her fiance. And what we know is that her fiance was eventually released. He left France, and her father was imprisoned at the age of 72 for 14 years, which is amazing at that time. And he was released and then died 6 years after that at the age of 92. So that's an extreme old age at that period.
Wow. So did Marie ever find out that her fiance ever, was able to escape, or were they separated forever, dramatically and tragically?
Indeed, they were separated forever, and we don't have any evidence that they ever met again, that there was ever any contact between them. So when Marie and her fiance were imprisoned in different prisons, that was really the end of their marriage, and they never saw each other again.
Wow. I've read that the women in prison received some food and supplies from supporters, for example, from a church in the Netherlands. And you also mentioned another pastor that Marie wrote letters to. What would have happened without those supplies? Did the government provide any food or other necessities?
The French prisons were run very, very cheaply, and prisoners received what they called the pain du roi, which means the bread of the king. And they received about 600 grams of bread each day, some water, and a little bit of straw, and the straw was for sleeping on. And that's all the prisoners received. And that was not enough to survive on, and everyone knew it. And so the prisoners were expected to write letters and to try to get food and money and supplies from friends and family. And that's the only way they could survive. And many of Marie's letters are letters where she's asking pastors and churches for help and for support. And we know that churches and generous people sent them money. Sometimes they sent them wood because they needed wood for cooking and for keeping warm. Sometimes they sent them oil for cooking, sometimes cloth and needles and thread, because the French Protestant women were very skilled sewers and lace makers, and they loved to get cloth and thread because that meant that they could make clothes and other things that they could sell. So yes, the only way that the women could survive was if Christians and supporters sent them the things that they needed.
Right. I've also read that the women in the prison suffered much from the humidity and cold, and possibly from malaria from the mosquitoes. How did Marie find the strength to hold on for so long?
Yes, the Tour de Constance, where Marie was imprisoned, was a terrible place because, and you already pointed out that there were very few windows. There were no proper heating facilities. There was a very smoky fireplace. There was a hole in the roof that let in rain and snow and mosquitoes. So it was an extremely uncomfortable and also dangerous place to live. So women caught cold and they got fevers, malaria. Many died in prison. And Marie, she found her strength in the Lord. And this is what she wrote to Anne in her 16th letter. She said to Anne, "We suffered terribly this winter. We were without any supplies except a little green wood. The worst of it was the snow on our terrace. The people of this region were terribly afflicted, and we felt the severity of it. Judge our condition. Yet, my darling daughter, we must always speak as models of patience. Though you slay me, Lord, I will always hope in you." And that's a quote from Job chapter 13. And she finishes by saying, "Let us trust in the Lord, and he will not abandon us." So it was her faith in Christ that gave her the strength to endure for 38 years in such a terrible place.
Wow, that was so powerful. So I read that after the prince that we mentioned earlier released the women, he closed the prison, quote, in the hope that it would never again be opened for such a purpose. And when the minister that had been appointed specifically to deal with the Huguenots heard about it, he ordered the prince to return all the women to the prison. But the prince told them that while the minister had the power to fire his subordinates, he could not stop them from acting according to their conscience and honor. I love that. Were there more people like this prince at that time?
Yes and no. There were, this is in the 1760s, so France was beginning to change, and there were people like Voltaire, you might have heard of, thinkers and philosophers like Voltaire who tried to push for more tolerance in society. Voltaire was not a Christian, but he thought that it was very cruel that Protestants were imprisoned in this way. And so there was a mood for change, but it was only very brave people that spoke up. And the Prince de Beauvau that you mentioned, I think was indeed a very brave man. And we're thankful for him because he was the one that risked his career. So he defied the king and he closed the prison, and that was what eventually led to the release of the final prisoners, including Marie, in 1768.
So we usually ask our guests if they have a favorite person in church history. I assume for you it's Marie Durand. Do you have another favorite?
Yes, I love church history, and I've got a lot of people that I'm very inspired by. But I've decided to choose for this podcast Adolf Monod, and he was another French Christian from the 1800s. So he lived from 1802 to 1856, and he was a French pastor. And his last church was in the middle of Paris. It's still there today. It's called the L'Oratoire de Louvre. And he was an amazing preacher and teacher of God's word. And he died at a very young age. He died at the age of 54 from cancer. And when he was dying, he preached sermons from his deathbed. And they're very, very powerful. And that was the first thing that I was able to translate from French to English. So I translated his sermons, and I was very, very inspired by them, and I still am. So he is one of my many favorites in Christian church history.
Sounds like a sequel book.
Yeah. So just a question about your church. Why is it called Scots Church? Was it founded by the Scots?
Yes, great question. So as you said, I'm the pastor of Scots Church in Fremantle, and Fremantle is the port city of Perth, which is in the south of Western Australia. And we are one of the most remote cities in the world. And Fremantle is a beautiful port city. And Australia was founded mainly by people from the UK. And there were many Scots immigrants, and they tended to be Presbyterian Christians. And so they founded a church called Scots Church. It's a Presbyterian church. And that's because the first members of that church were all Scottish immigrants. So these days, we still have many Scottish people in our church, but we don't have that strong Scottish heritage anymore. And we are from all over the world now. But we like being called Scots Church. It reminds us of our history.
Dr. Markham, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. And listeners, keep telling us what you think of these episodes, and please keep asking questions. We'll pass them on to our guest experts as soon as possible. And if you write in after this episode, you'll be entered to win a copy of Simonetta Carr's book on Marie Durand, courtesy of Reformation Heritage Books. So make sure you check out our website, kidstalkchurchhistory.org. In partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, and on behalf of my co-hosts Emma and Grace, I'm Sophia. Thank you for listening to Kids Talk Church History.